Hello and welcome to CNC World, broadcasting live from North America. I'm Xie Ge in Washington. This is our special coverage of the ongoing 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China. At the opening session of the Party Congress on Wednesday, Xi Jinping painted a bright future of the world's second-largest economy. In the report, Xi hailed achievements in reform, opening up, and socialist modernization during the past 5 years. He also said socialism with Chinese characteristics has crossed the threshold into a new era. In today's program, we look into the details of the report to see China's accomplishments, future development path, and how China influences the world in various aspects. Joining me in the studio today is Mr. Stephen Orlins, President of the National Committee of the U.S. China Relations. Welcome to our program, sir.
Pleasure.
Well, the report delivered by Xi took about 3.5 hours. Our correspondent Liliana Worth gives us the highlights of the report in the press center in Beijing. Let's take a look.
I'm Liliana Worth in Beijing. As the Congress officially opened, President Xi Jinping delivered a report on the party's achievements, priorities and vision as we have here. And to give you a quick insight into the report, we have a rundown of 9 key aspects. Number 1, the report outlined development of socialist thought. Xi said the CPC had given shape to thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. This is a long-term guide to action that the party must adhere to and develop. It builds on the party's existing theory being integrated into Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the theory of 3 represents, and the scientific outlook on development. For the party, this is the latest achievement of adapting Marxism to the Chinese context. Number 2, the report also outlined aims to develop China into, quote, a great modern socialist country by the middle of the 21st century. And this is to be done through a 2-stage development plan. From 2020 to 2035, the CPC is to build on a moderately prosperous society to ensure that socialist modernization is basically realized. And then from 2035 to the mid-21st century, the CPC will then work towards developing China into a great modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious and beautiful. Number 3, on China's economy, Xi said that it had been transitioning from a stage of rapid growth to a phase of high-quality development. He also said the country would support state capital in growing stronger, doing better, growing bigger, making Chinese enterprises globally competitive firms. Number 4 is on opening up, which of course is of particular interest to our international viewers. Xi said that China will only become more and more open, stating that China will significantly ease market access and protect the rights and interests of foreign investors. Number 5 is on law. Xi said the CPC would set up a central leading group for advancing law-based governance in all areas. The party would strengthen oversight to ensure compliance with the Constitution, advance constitutionality review, as well as safeguard the authority of the Constitution. Number 6 is on ecological progress. The CPC has incorporated Beautiful China into its 2-stage development plan for building a great modern socialist country. The modernization will feature harmonious coexistence between man and nature. As part of that, there will be more regulation on natural resource assets and natural ecosystems. Number 7 is the plan for China's armed forces. Xi said that by 2020, the military mechanization should be basically achieved, while the modernization of national defense and armed forces should be basically completed by 2035. This is all with an aim of making China's armed forces into a world-class military by the middle of the century. Number 8 is the CPC's view of diplomacy. Xi stressed that China would never seek hegemony or engage in expansion, no matter the stage of development it reaches. And finally, number 9, this is the vision for the CPC's party building. Calling corruption the greatest threat the party faces, Xi said the fight against corruption never ends. He said the party is determined to secure a sweeping victory against corruption to avoid the historical cycle of rise and fall.
Well, from the highlights, the report outlines the CPC's priorities and visions. It has triggered heated discussions both at home and abroad. Here is a glimpse of coverage by Western media. The New York Times says, and I quote, "Mr. Xi's priorities shone through. This is a leader who believes China is on the cusp of greatness." CNN says the meeting will also chart the country's future course in a world where China's reach is now extending and being felt further than ever before. China's economic development, opening up, and anti-graft campaign were also highlights. CNBC says the president also claimed during his address that China will let the market play a decisive role in resource allocation in the economy. Beijing has called for a greater role for market forces in the economy in order to improve efficiency and develop a more sustainable growth model. Reuters says Chinese President Xi Jinping on Wednesday laid out a confident vision for a more prosperous nation and its role in the world, stressing the importance of wiping out corruption and curbing industrial overcapacity, income inequality, and pollution. And BBC says since Mr. Xi took power in 2012, China's economy has continued to grow rapidly. Xi said China will not close its doors to the world and promised to lower barriers for foreign investors. He also introduced measures to increase party discipline and touched on his wide-reaching corruption crackdown that has punished more than 1 million officials. So from these reviews and comments, we can see that the Western media focused mainly on China's development plan, economy, opening up, ecological progress, and so on. So, Mr. Orlins, which part of the report impressed you the most?
Well, first, I would say what impressed me the most was the vision that I had as I was watching the report. From my perspective, dealing with U.S. China relations, the most important part of the speech, the one which was most meaningful to me, was dealing with, he said China would treat all businesses registered in China the same, fairly. This suggests that foreign investors in China will be given what is called national treatment. That is treatment equal to Chinese enterprises that are registered in China. And that to me is an important statement because often U.S. investors, again, I'm dealing with U.S. China relations, are concerned that they are not being treated equally. So here President Xi is saying to the world, come to China and we will treat you fairly. And that's very important because that is a pillar of U.S. China relations, that U.S. investment in China is a pillar, just as Chinese investment in the United States is a pillar. So again, that is a narrow part of the speech, but it's what, for me, as somebody working on U.S. China relations, is most important.
So do you see any opportunities for Chinese companies to invest in U.S. infrastructure? Because President Trump has proposed a $1 trillion infrastructure investment plan recently.
Well, I have been a strong advocate of Chinese investment in U.S. infrastructure for many, many, many years. I think that China's experience in building its own infrastructure over the last 15, 20 years has given it relevant experience and technology that would be applicable to the United States. So whether it's our railways, our subways, our bridges, our tunnels, that China has relevant experience. That's number one. So I think that's an opportunity. Second, China has $3 trillion of reserves in predominantly US dollars. That money should be put into work, should be put to work. Having it kind of sit in US treasuries is not so good, actually, in my view. Much better off investing it in infrastructure. I mean, my great hope is I came down here on the train from New York, and when I compare that to, I was in China week before last, and I took the train from Beijing to Jinan, which when I first went to China in 1979 would have taken 9 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours. Now I did it in less than 2 hours. The trip from Washington to New York has been the same over my entire life. It still is it's a train that vibrates, it's a train that needs new infrastructure investment. So my dream, I don't know if it's realizable, is that that corridor between Washington and Boston get rebuilt with Chinese technology and Chinese capital. I think that would be hugely successful. But there are numerous infrastructure projects that President Trump has designated as priorities. He's put out a list of 50 infrastructure projects, and they're open to all. They're open to Chinese, Japanese, Italian, British, French, whomever wants to invest. And living in New York now, I certainly see the desperate need for investment in infrastructure.
Yeah, well, you talked about the high-speed rail in China. That was absolutely impressive. And talking about this infrastructure construction, we have to mention the Belt and Road Initiative. And there are increasing anti-globalization sentiment in some countries. So what do you think this Belt and Road Initiative and some other proposals China has put forward to, what are their challenges in this increasing anti-globalization sentiment?
Well, first of all, I should say that the Belt Road Initiative is a tremendously beneficial initiative for the world and for the United States. That there's some in the United States who think it's not so wonderful. I actually think it's wonderful because those kinds of investments, whether in the areas where BRI is going, are going to lift tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, which is just good. That's just a fundamental positive role. Second, when these people are lifted out of poverty, some of these places are actually breeding grounds for terrorists. When people are lifted out of poverty, it's far less likely that at the place where they're lifted out of poverty will become a breeding ground for terrorism. So first, I would say that. Second, 12 years ago, when I first became president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, Bob Zoellick, who was then Deputy Secretary of State, subsequently went on to be President of the World Bank, made a speech at our annual dinner. And he talked about China becoming a responsible stakeholder in the world system. Responsible stakeholder. I believe BRI. I believe AIIB. I believe these initiatives that China is undertaking is a fulfillment of Bob Zoellick's hope that China would be a responsible stakeholder, that it would play a positive and constructive role in the world. And I think that BRI is, and I think that it was mentioned in President Xi's speech to the 19th Party Congress was very important. It is a huge priority for China, and it's exactly what it should be doing. Positive influence in places which really need to be lifted out of poverty, where they need economic development, where a recreation of the Silk Road is actually a wonderful concept because economic development will follow that road on both sides, and that's a positive.
Yeah, and what you've talked about are the vision included in China's great plan to build China into a great modern socialist country by the middle of the century. And we know right now China is currently building itself towards a moderately prosperous society by 2020. And by 2035, it'll ensure that socialist modernization is basically realized. And by the middle of the century, China will build itself into a great modern socialist country which is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. So compared to previous plan, we notice that 2 words have been added, which is great and beautiful. So how do you see these updates?
Well, I think the beautiful is simply a way of dealing with what is the greatest problem that the Chinese population faces today. That, I lived in Beijing for many years. I still spend months and months in Beijing every year. When you get up in the morning, then it's true whether you're rich or whether you're poor, whether you're educated or you're uneducated, you see the pollution. So when I see President Xi talk about a beautiful China, I think what he's talking about, to me what he's talking about is one which is environmentally sustainable. And we see enormous investments in renewable energy, enormous investments in controlling pollution. But so far, we're seeing some results, but not sufficient results. I was in Beijing 3 weeks ago. It was September, and I got up in the morning and I couldn't see anywhere outside because the pollution was so significant. So beautiful really relates to an environmentally friendly environment where Chinese citizens get up in the morning and they can see the blue sky, they can drink the water, the land is not filled with, the soil is still usable, that there's so much to be done on the environment, that he has set that as one of his goals. A strong China is really a reflection of the history of China, that for 150 years, there were countries who had extraterritorial privileges in China, where China really was, its territory was occupied by foreigners. And what President Xi is saying is that era is over, and we're going to be a strong one. But you can't look at strong without looking at the word peaceful in his words, that when he talks to the 19th Party Congress, he talked about a peaceful and prosperous China, and that China is not going to seek to infringe on anyone else's sovereignty, that it's a concept that is very consistent with my view of Chinese history, tradition, and culture. That for centuries, China built the Great Wall, not to attack anybody, but to keep people out. That the history does not generally suggest that China is going to be attacking foreign countries. And that was part of what his 19th Party Congress speech was about. It's peaceful. It believes in sovereignty, its own sovereignty, that is, no one can infringe on its sovereignty, but the sovereignty of neighboring and other states, that China will not be going out and projecting its military power in such a way that it's going to infringe on the sovereignty of others.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the term beautiful. So that means ecological civilization must be adhere to green development.
Yes.
Yeah. So how do you see the prospect of the cooperation between the U.S. and China in this field?
Well, I think on the business-to-business level and the people-to-people level, there is enormous opportunity for cooperation. Sharing of technologies, things that are developed in China, implemented in the United States, things that are developed in the United States, implemented in China, businesses that cooperate and lead to a greener world, lead to less use of fossil fuels, lead to fewer carbon emissions. All of that are areas for cooperation. China is making enormous strides in this area, and U.S. businesses and U.S. NGOs recognize in the environmental area that cooperating with China is a great thing, because number one, it's a huge market. Number two, the government recognizes how important this is. So it recognizes, and people in the United States, NGOs and businesses, recognize that President Xi's commitment to a beautiful China, to an environmentally sustainable China, is something which is good for the world, good for the Chinese people, and good for American business.
Yeah, exactly. It's good for the world. So this is actually one of the concepts that Xi Jinping has been constantly called on the world to work together to build a common community for a shared future for mankind. So how do you think is the significance of this concept to the world?
I think it's hugely significant. We've seen, President Xi, the speech at the 19th Party Congress was remarkably visionary. AIIB is a very practical step towards fulfilling the vision of kind of a harmonious world. Making investments in countries that need this kind of economic development through a beautifully transparent global institution. I visited AIIB 2 weeks ago with a group of American congressmen, and it's a remarkably open, transparent, global leadership that's headquartered in China. And China has created this institution, but it is not a Chinese institution. Most Americans, it's an international institution. Most Americans will say, no, it's a Chinese institution. And I go, no, the Chinese helped create it, just as the U.S. helped create the World Bank. The Japanese and the U.S. helped create the ADB, Asian Development Bank. Those are not U.S. or Japanese institutions. They're global institutions that were created by these countries. Now we see China having created AIIB, and Chairman Jin is a remarkable global civil servant. He's an international civil, he is Chinese, but he is an international civil servant. We met with his whole management team, which looked like the United Nations. It had people from all over. So that is evidence that China is moving in that direction. BRI is evidence that China is moving in that direction.
Exactly. And I heard that some U.S. firms are interested in participating in the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes.
So could you share with us what areas could China and the U.S. cooperate on this?
I think, you know, there are many areas where U.S. Services and equipment are the best in the world. And I think Chinese companies that will be the overall contractor for a project know that they should be going to GE or to Bechtel or to other major American companies to cooperate with them. But it's over the broad range of projects that are going to be funded through the BRI are going to be ones where U.S. companies have expertise within that and probably are already working with the Chinese companies in China, so they will work with them in Pakistan or in wherever else they go in the world. So I would expect the U.S. companies that are already working with Chinese companies to continue to work with them outside of China.
We certainly look forward to how CPC will determine the future development path for China for the next 5 years and beyond. Thank you, Mr. Orlins, for coming today.
Pleasure to be here.
And that's all for today's special coverage on CPC's 19th National Congress. Thank you for joining us today, and stay tuned to CNC for more of the latest news and headlines from around the world. I'm Xie in Washington. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.